So that even though I've lived away from my hometown for almost 40 years now, it's my hometown. It always will be. It has a place in my heart. It's the only place I really think of as home. It's a very deep, centred thing. This is where my tupuna are from. This is the land that I connect to. And that's very much an Indigenous thing, I think. And I think this is a connection we have with the Jewish people, that they're very much the same. They may live all over the world in different places here in New Zealand, but Israel, Jerusalem is their home. Their heart is always yearning for their home in Jerusalem. That's the place of their ancestors, their tupuna, that's where they're from. So that idea of connection to a particular whenua, connection to tupuna, is part of being Indigenous. But briefly, what do we mean when we're talking about the Jews? So the whakapapa of the Jews, descendants of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, who is also called Israel. This is the biblical definition. Also called Hebrews or children of Israel or Israelites, these terms used interchangeably in the Bible. The word Jew comes from Judah, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, one of the descendants of Jacob or Israel. And that word comes from Judea, the place. So you're getting the connection of name and place. And by New Testament times, Jew and Israelite became interchangeable. Currently, according to Jewish law, a child born to a Jewish mother or an adult who is converted to Judaism is also considered a Jew. I just want to give you a bit of an idea of the size of Israel when we're talking about it. I mean, many of you have been there, but it's so tiny. It's about the size of Northland, from Whangaparoa. And this is the tiny nation, tiny piece of land that is the most contested real estate in the world. Also, for perspective, you can see here, you can see Israel in that little brown spot just beside the sea there, and surrounded by all these large Arab and Muslim nations. And that picture in itself can give you an idea of some of the challenges that Israel faces, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So we recognise that Jews are Indigenous to the land of Israel. There's no universally recognised definition of indigeneity. This is quite a good summary. The ethnogenesis of a particular group in a particular land within which a unique culture and language develops. So I find that useful because the Jewish culture, language, religion all developed within that particular land of Judea, Samaria. For Māori, the distinctive Māori culture developed here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And while there are similarities that were brought from other places, a unique culture developed here. So I think that's quite a helpful definition of indigeneity. And now this is a sort of criteria that's been established by the UN to define indigeneity. And I'll go through this in a bit more detail to understand Israel as Indigenous. So the first thing, continuously occupied ancestral lands. Now there's been a distinct and continuous Jewish presence in the land of Israel. Prior to 1948, the land had twice been under Jewish rule, under King David, then in the Hasmonean dynasty. But for the most part, there had been almost 3,000 years of foreign control over the land of Israel under the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Romans, Byzantine, Arab, Ottoman, British empires. Regardless, there's always been a Jewish presence, even though sometimes very small. So the idea in Māori is that of keeping ahika, always a presence to keep ahika over a land. Number two, common ancestry with the original occupants. Now, the Jewish people are undoubtedly one of the most ancient of Indigenous people, still inhabiting its ancient homeland, the birthplace of its forefathers, Isaac and Jacob, the land to which Moses and Joshua led the Jewish people, where King Solomon built the first Jewish temple, where King David laid the cornerstone for his palace in Jerusalem, King Herod resided and was buried, the land where Jesus of Nazareth lived and conducted his life. Written records, genetic studies, alongside extensive historical and archaeological evidence, demonstrate that Jews today share a common Middle Eastern origin and peoplehood. Number 3, self-identity as Indigenous peoples. Jews have always regarded themselves as members of a single Jewish nation, Am Yisrael. The collective memory of their forced removal from the land of Israel and the hope of eventual return were integral parts of Jewish belief and identity for over 19 centuries. Number 4, a distinct common culture and language, and a religion that emphasises spiritual ties to the land. So Jewish traditions demanded that they never forget Jerusalem, that it should be in their thoughts always, even during their happy hours and their sad hours. 3 times a day, traditionally observant Jews face towards Jerusalem to pray. Jews mourn the destruction of their temples annually on Tish B'Av, during Pesach, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and then pray next year in Jerusalem. And note that the Passover festival is over 3,500 years old. It was in the land that their identity as a nation was forged, their language and script developed, their beliefs, customs and traditions began. To Jews, it's the most sacred place in the world. It's where their ancestors and prophets lie buried. Jewish ethnobotanical traditions are also based on the plants native to Eretz Israel. The 7 species of the land of Israel, wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives and dates, have long been understood to possess important symbolic, medicinal and spiritual properties. So these are all important aspects of indigeneity, and the Jews fit every one of these features. So why does it matter? Well, the reason it matters is because today there's a narrative that's been created which says that the Palestinian Arabs are the indigenous population, and central to the conflict is the idea that Jews stole and now occupy the land of the indigenous Arab population. And this narrative has filtered out from academia, been promoted by media and politicians, and strengthened through long and frequent repetition, which is the most classic propaganda techniques. The problem is that this narrative is false. Who are the Palestinians? They are Arabs indigenous to Arabia, all these surrounding nations that we see on the map here. The Arabs' homeland is Arabia, the southwestern peninsula of Asia, present-day Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, or the Persian Gulf, and South Yemen. So in the 7th century, with the birth of the new Islamic religion, the Arabs established an empire from the Atlantic Ocean to the border of China, including the land of Palestine, which was named Syria Palestina around 135 CE by the conquering Romans, in order to erase Jewish connection. It was named after the Jews' ancient enemies, the Philistines, who were non-Semites, meaning that the Arabs, the land has no actual connection to the Arabs, who are Semites. So Arabic became the dominant language and Islam the predominant religion throughout a large part of the subjugated territories. And over the centuries, the land of Palestine was ruined. And here in the upcoming notes, I've drawn on the work of Professor Dov Bing. It was ruined partly by warring imperial dynasties, by Arabs, Turks, Persians, Egyptians, Crusaders, by invading hordes of Mongols. Then there were the revolts of local chieftains and civil strife. So under Ottoman misrule, Bedouin raiders plundered livestock and destroyed crops, plaguing the life of the farmer. So this image is from the mid-19th century, and travellers to the land in this time describe it as a wasteland. And here again I'm quoting Dov Bing, who says that by the middle of the 19th century, hundreds of years of abuse had turned the country into a treeless waste, with a sprinkling of emaciated towns, malaria-ridden swamps in its once fertile northern valleys, the once thriving South Negev, now a desert, The population had dwindled almost to nothing. So it was to this wasteland that Jews began to return in the 19th century to their ancient homeland, when, as a result of the political shifts, the opportunity arose. They proceeded over the course of the early 20th century with a lot of sweat and tears to turn the wasteland into productive land, literally making the deserts bloom. So again, I ask, why does it matter? Because history's been rewritten to tell the story that Indigenous Palestinians lived in the land from time immemorial and were dispossessed by foreign Jews. It's simply not accurate. And this narrative has been built on myth after myth. So this myth of ethnic cleansing claims that in 1948, the Jews ethnically cleansed the Indigenous Palestinians. This is not what happened. After declaring statehood, the nascent Jewish state was surrounded by 5 Arab armies intent on destroying her. The Arab inhabitants were urged to leave by the Arab leadership while they set out to destroy the Jewish state. Some Arabs fled voluntarily. Many of the wealthier Arabs left before the war began. Some were forced to leave for strategic and military reasons. In addition, a similar number of Jews had to flee from Arab lands and became refugees. And they were all resettled in the new state of Israel. So while we hear a lot about the Palestinian refugees, there were also these Jewish refugees who had come from Arabia. So from the 1940s until the 1970s, nearly 1 million Jews were expelled from their homes across Arab countries, such as Iraq and Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Yemen, Libya, Algeria. Jews were frequently subject to pogroms, systematic violence and religious persecution. Arab regimes increased their hostility toward Jews because of the very existence of Israel. And a side point to note is that there's a false narrative that paints the Jews as white European colonisers. More than half the Jews in Israel today are dark-skinned because their forebears lived in Arabic lands for centuries. And there are Jews who never left their homeland who are also dark-skinned. So the ethnic cleansing myth, it really doesn't stand up under closer scrutiny. What about genocide? Well, the Palestinian population has risen from 850,000 in 1948 to around 5 million today or more. That's not how genocide works. Meanwhile, the Jewish worldwide population still hasn't recovered from the Holocaust. That's the true genocide. There are 15.3 million Jews living around the world. The global population is over 1 million less than it was before the Holocaust. 7 million live in Israel and 6 million live in the US. And it's worth noting that Palestinians didn't identify as a people until the 1960s. They first started calling themselves Palestinians in 1964. So again, the genocide myth doesn't stack up. What about apartheid? Now, apartheid is one that's very popular today. It's been pushed quite a lot by NGOs, and there's a long history of this apartheid smear. It first appeared in the anti-Zionist campaigns waged by the communist states during the Cold War. A key phase came in 1975, when a coalition emerged at the UN to attack Israel, the Soviet bloc, the Arab states, and the non-aligned movement. Then in 2001, a UN conference in Durban launched a concerted campaign to label Israel a racist apartheid state. These lies are all part of ongoing war against the Jewish people in Israel. The reality is that Israel is far from being an apartheid state. This is an Arab woman who works in a hospital in Tel Aviv. 20% of medical teams in Israel, be they doctors, nurses, or paramedics, are Arab. Many Palestinians from the West Bank and some from Gaza work and study in Israeli hospitals. All citizens are guaranteed equal rights, including the right to vote. Israel has a robust justice system that counters discrimination. Israel's Arab minority participates fully in the political process and participates in government. Israeli universities are integrated, and there's a thriving Arabic media, literature and theatre scene. And we could go on and on. freedom of speech and assembly is upheld, and all are free to criticise the government, and they do so. So the apartheid accusation also doesn't stack up. So why has there been no progress in this conflict? Well, there are a number of reasons, and I'm just listing a few of them here. The first, Palestinian Rejectionism. They have repeatedly rejected offers of land for peace. There's been a determination on the part of the Palestinian leadership not to accept any Jewish presence in the region. When you hear protesters saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, what they mean is that whole area is to be free of Jews. It's actually a call for genocide, if you understand what they're saying. And while the Palestinian government might make noises about occupation and settlements, apartheid and genocide, these are really just excuses. Israel has shown a willingness to make peace. They made peace with Egypt, with Jordan, and particularly since 2020, the Abraham Accords have seen peace made with the United Arab Emirates, with Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, and it's spreading across the Middle East. And a good example of the fact that it's not Israel that's the obstacle to peace is the fact that Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, completely withdrew all Jewish people from Gaza, evacuated 8,500 Israelis from the region. They did that in the hope that that would lead to peace, but instead the Gazan people voted in Hamas, a terrorist organisation that has launched numerous rocket attacks on Israel. And it states in their charter that genocide is their goal. They will not accept a Jewish state, and they're determined to get rid of it. So Palestinian rejectionism is a huge part of it. And the Palestinian society, there's a lack of freedom. There's the right to vote. There hasn't been a free election since 2005. The Palestinian Authority is rife with corruption. There's no freedom of the press. The government provides incentives for terrorism, payments to the families of terrorists, called a pay-to-stay policy. And I think the saddest part of all is the children. The children are indoctrinated to hate Jews. They're indoctrinated in a school curriculum that encourages violence, jihad, martyrdom, anti-Semitism, hate and intolerance. They go to summer camps where they're encouraged to become martyrs. This is really child abuse, and it's a war crime. And in fact, New Zealand contributes to this because we fund UNRWA. UNRWA doesn't produce the curriculum, but they facilitate Palestinian Authority curriculum that contains this terrible material in it. And the UN has been one of the biggest perpetrators of the attacks of Israel. We certainly don't advocate blind support for the State of Israel. Like any nation, Israel has its faults. But the reality is that Israel faces an ongoing attack at the UN that is unfair, it's biased, it's disproportionate, and designed to undermine her very existence. The small Jewish state is quite literally outnumbered at the UN. And as a coalition, we care about the Palestinians. We stand with the brave Palestinians who are standing against the corruption of their leaders. But we believe that the record shows that Israel is ready and willing to help its neighbours if they would be willing to accept Jewish presence in the region. Israel is not willing to leave the pages of history. The best thing we can do to help the Palestinians, I believe, is to support Israel.